Okay, guys, so here's where we left off. Yeah, I'm gonna have to show you this. Well, now I want to show you this grody photo because I think it's really representative of a potential case. But I'll try to get past this photo really fast. But this next photo is a person who actually died of an accidental drowning. So this was not criminal in any way. And they were, basically a healthy, fit 30-something male. But this is an example of what being in water does to a body, and, relatively warm water. So yeah, this is obviously terrible. What I want you to notice here is, first of all, here's a perfect example of forensic entomology, because you can see this person's eyes are gone. And that is undoubtedly, being acted upon by arthropods that are aquatic. So that's one element. But if you'll notice, look at this person's mouth, he's missing teeth. However, that is not, he actually did have a full set of teeth. He was a, healthy individual. I'm going to fast forward to this. But when decomposition happens, teeth can potentially fall out. But the assumption shouldn't be made that, oh, this person didn't have these teeth to begin with. So yeah, that can happen. But he was, identified by the teeth that were remaining, because, as I said, one tooth is enough to do an identification. So this is an example of how small teeth can be at a scene. So this also relates back to why anthropologists are so important in doing excavations, because yeah, you don't want to take, some type of sharp garden tool and not know what you're looking for and get in there and potentially either not find a small piece of evidence because it looks like we have a tooth here and then we have part of a tooth here, or potentially, break that tooth apart, put impact marks on it that could be misinterpreted. So, just another shout out to this is why we need anthropologists. So here's an example of a person who actually had a broken jaw. And so they had this type of device put in. So there would be dental records to compare that to. There's likely a lot number printed somewhere or some type of identifier on that device that can be traced back to the dentist who put it in, and that can be used for an identification as well. So here's an example where I talked about how tissue decomposes, but teeth don't. Okay, so this is actually what putrefaction or extreme decomposition looks like. It kind of ends up, being this brownish, greenish, substance. But you'll notice the teeth are completely intact. They are not going to decompose. The tissue will, and the teeth might fall out due to the loosening of the muscles that are holding the teeth in, but the teeth themselves are going to be fully intact. And every one of these not only has their own markings that an odontologist could interpret, but also break that tooth open, you're going to have a great source of DNA. So here's an example of some remains from a high-speed event, which was a plane crash. And you can see here that you've got part of a jaw here with teeth. You also have some teeth here. So these remains, as long as there are ante-mortem records to compare to, they're going to be very, there's a very high probability that this person is going to be able to be identified. And they could be identified, simply from just a single tooth, but luckily in this case, you have more than one tooth to compare to. You also have jaw fragments. Okay, so here's an example of some dentures, and normally dentures, can be used to identify a body. Let's say that there was a fire. So for example, these dentures belong to, it looks like E. Pinning. However, I will caution you, there was a case in New York State where it was a nursing home fire, and several of the residents, I believe it was 17 residents, died. And one of the ways they identified these residents by looking at the dentures found in the mouths of the deceased people. And it was only after that they were talking to employees of that particular residential facility, and the employees said, yeah, one thing that amazed me was how often people actually share dentures. And I've never heard of that, but I guess it's not an uncommon practice where, you know, let's say Mildred either lost or misplaced her dentures, but she needs to go to the dining room to eat. You know, she could ask her, you know, roommate, hey, can I borrow your dentures? I need to go eat. And then she'll give them back. So potentially they could have misidentified some of those people by not doing DNA or not looking, you know, more specifically into one of the methods for identification. Luckily in this case, they did go back and confirm everything and everything was fine. But, you know, I guess people in those facilities sometimes share their dentures. So, you know, you can't always go by that alone to identify them. Okay, let's talk about bite marks a little bit. So bite mark evidence, the odontologist can first of all recognize that something is a bite mark, and then document it, and then also be able to preserve the evidence. Obviously photography is going to be really, really helpful in this. So the place that you find bite marks, you know, if a person, first of all, I want to caution this to law enforcement too, how I've talked about how people escalate. You know, if you have a person who wants to commit a residential burglary, normally they're after money or stuff. They want to get in and they want to get out. They don't want to get caught. Okay? If you have someone who commits a burglary and they go into that home and they make themselves at home, so they're going to drink at the scene, they're going to eat some of the people's, you know, food, that's a red flag, because that is kind of the element of not only am I going to break in and steal your stuff, but I'm going to make myself at home. And it's kind of a, you know, a power move, kind of a, you know, something to even creep the homeowners out more. So future law enforcement, pay attention to behaviors like that, first of all. But from an odontology standpoint, you know, you may see bite marks like someone takes a bite out of an apple and then throws it in the trash. That is not only going to have a usable bite mark that can be documented, but also you're going to be able to swab that bite mark and get saliva and potentially the DNA from that person. Now, bite marks can also be found on human skin, both living and deceased victims. Oftentimes, if a person is found and then they're taken to, let's say, the local medical examiner's office, those bite marks may not be apparent you know, until the next day when the autopsy is going to be produced. You know, you probably know this, and because a bite mark it's a bruise basically. And how many times have you noticed a bruise on yourself and you're like, where did that come from? I don't remember hitting anything. Okay, so bruises take time to develop because they're basically hematomas. And so that can be found on both living and deceased victims. By far, the most common case type where we find bite marks are in sexual assault cases. Okay, so here's some examples of bite marks, and these are all on, actually this is on a deceased person where you can see here's the bite mark here, and then it's like there were multiple bite marks. Here's one that's really intact, and this is actually, both of these are deceased people. This is a living victim, and you can see, but it's a bruise, and over time it's going to become more diffuse, so it's important to photograph it right away. Not being trained as a dentist, I look at that and that just looks really diffuse to me, but it's amazing how odontologists can get in there and they can tell exactly what tooth made that particular bite mark, that bruise, and be able to tell you things about those teeth. So yeah, it's pretty amazing what they can do. Okay, yet again, here's another example. So yeah, here it's becoming more diffuse. Here you can see individual teeth marks. And once again, bite marks are really pattern evidence. And so it can be what's there, like obviously that, a tooth made that, a tooth made that. But notice here, you've got this empty space. So either there's a tooth missing or there's some type of gap in between teeth. And odontologists can certainly do comparisons to known standards. Here's an example of a bite mark on an apple found at a crime scene. So yeah, potentially an odontologist can look at the bite mark. And then what I like about it is let's swab the heck out of that. And I bet, we're going to get saliva and we're going to get DNA from whoever bit into that apple. On another note, I would probably want this processed for latent prints as well to see if we can, attack it 3 ways. So by far, the most significant bite mark case relates back to, unfortunately, our gold standard of serial killer, Ted Bundy. And you remember about Ted, he was a narcissistic sexual sadist. He had over 30 victims in multiple states. Remember, he was the reason why CODIS was developed. One thing, if you're looking for a good read that's really interesting, but is not written in like super technical language, it's just a really good, really a story. And it's amazing to me that it's nonfiction as opposed to fiction, is called The Stranger Beside Me by Ann Rule. And this book is really interesting because Ann Rule is a famous true crime writer. You know, she recently passed away, unfortunately, but when she was starting out, she was a part-time reporter for the Seattle Times. She was a single mother of 5. And also, and I don't know how the heck she found the time to do this with 5 kids, but she also volunteered on the suicide hotline in Seattle, and she shared a cubicle with Ted Bundy. And so she would talk to him about these Ted cases and be like, you know, Ted, who is committing these murders? And he would say, boy, you know, someone obviously, you know, who is awful. I don't know. And so she, you know, it just goes to show how these killers can compartmentalize as well. And one of her famous quotes was, you know, I know Ted Bundy took a lot of lives, but I also witnessed him saving a lot of lives, because I guess no one was better than Ted of talking people down from suicide. So it just goes to show you they have their extreme light sides and their extreme dark sides. But a really, really interesting book, you know, if you're want to read something during, you know, this quarantine time, this is a really good one. So remember, Ted Bundy, he's an organized serial killer, the ultimate, you know, narcissistic sociopath, highly manipulative. When he finally committed his final crimes in Florida, where he was apprehended, before he killed his very last victim, who was a 10-year-old girl, he committed a very frenzied attack in a sorority house on the Florida State campus. So it was the Chi Omega sorority. And at this point, Ted was probably, you know, breaking down mentally. He wasn't good at covering up his crimes. He wasn't good at, you know, using his usual ruses. And so he was kind of operating on pure rage. And so when he broke in, he attacked women, he bludgeoned them to death. 2 of them ended up dying. The other 2 were severely injured. And they discovered a bite mark on the buttocks of one of the women. Okay, so here's the bite mark. And then here was how the odontologist documented that bite mark. And this evidence had never been accepted in a criminal court before, so this is the first landmark bite mark case. Now, luckily, by the time Ted was caught, you know, he was not going to be a person who was going to go to the dentist, right? He was, you know, the top wanted fugitive in the United States. And so by the time he was caught, his teeth, which are shown up here, were pretty gnarly. And so the odontologist was able to get a cast of Ted's teeth and then compare it to the bite mark. And basically say that, you know, the person who left this bite mark is consistent with the defendant's teeth, and called it a match, and that aided in the conviction of Ted Bundy. Remember, DNA was not around, so you didn't have that type of compelling evidence. Okay, here's another case example, and this is another example of how, you know, odontology in the form of bite marks and DNA go well together. So here's a guy who was committing, you know, I believe it was a homicide. Yeah, it was a homicide, and uses his teeth to rip off some duct tape to bind the victim, but doesn't take the roll with him. And so left on that roll of duct tape is a perfectly preserved bite mark, which can also then be swabbed with a sterile swab and allow us to get DNA from that person as well. So it's a, you know, it's kind of a 1-2 punch. Okay, first of all, this is not an abused baby, and this baby is very much alive. Okay, so I want to make you aware of that. And if you look at this baby, that's a well-nourished baby, right? Every baby should be fat and happy and, you know, have all that baby fat. But this baby was in daycare, and the daycare provider noticed this bite mark, Okay, call the authorities because obviously they're worried about the baby. And when they investigated and showed this bite mark to an odontologist, what they determined was that this was a pediatric bite mark, meaning that it was made by a child. It was not an adult who was abusing this child. It was basically, you know, an older sibling that, I don't like having you around because I used to get all the attention, you know, you took my toy, whatever the motivation was. Yeah, should you keep a better eye on your kids and, you know, hey, Bobby, don't bite your little brother. But the point was that the odontologist was able to determine that the bite mark was made by a child and not by an adult. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there, get this uploading, and then we'll finish up in video number 3. Thank you.